Week 5, Memory, Multi-Store. Without memory, life as we know it would not be possible. We would constantly be surprised and intrigued if you like novelty, or terrified if you are threatened by the unfamiliar. We start by introducing some of the important ways that cognitive psychologists have come to view memory. One of the critical questions we consider is whether there are different forms of memory, or memory stores, or whether there is just a single store. Another issue covered is why we remember some things and forget others. To begin with, let's consider one of the most influential models, the Atkinson and Shiffrin model, also known as the multi-store memory model. The multi-store memory model. Before looking at the model, it is necessary to recognise what is meant by architecture. Architecture refers to the way in which a memory system is organised, whereas its processes refer to the activities occurring within the memory system. So the architecture is the organisation of the memory system. It has 3 component parts and 4 processes. The processes are what's happening in the memory system. So the parts of the architecture are the sensory stores, short-term memory and long-term memory. And its processes are attention, rehearsal, encoding and retrieval. According to the multi-store model, environmental stimulation is initially processed by the sensory stores. These stores are modality specific, for example, vision and hearing. Modalities. Information is held very briefly in the sensory stores, with some being attended to and processed further by the short-term store, and some information processed in the short-term store is transferred to the long-term store. There is a direct relationship between the amount of rehearsal in the short-term store and the strength of stored memory trace in long-term memory. So stimuli is received by our sensory buffers. If we pay attention to that, it'll go to our short-term memory. And then if we rehearse that, it'll go to our long-term memory, or some of it will. So I'll say that again. Stimuli is received by our sensory buffers. If we forget it, it will decay. If we pay attention to it, it'll go to our short-term memory. If we forget what's in our short-term memory, that's called displacement. But if we rehearse it, it'll go to our long-term memory. And in our long-term memory, if we forget things, it's called interference. So our memory stores have sensory stores, short-term memory and long-term memory. Short-term memory, or STM, has a limited capacity. Only about 7 items can be stored at a time. So that's the plus or minus 2. So between 5 and 9 things can be remembered at once. So short-term memory has very limited duration, typically between 15 and 30 seconds. The standard model of short-term memory has the following features: internally represented information that is in a state of activation, activated information that is accessed immediately and effortlessly, activated information from long-term memory held in the short-term store, decay of activation causes information to leave the short-term store, and decay can be prevented by rehearsal. The initial short-term memory model didn't suggest information could be broken down into modalities. It is useful to look at what STM actually is in different modalities. How much can we keep in memory and how accurate or precise what we keep in our memory really is. Slot versus resources. Do we need visual slots to store things? What about the resources only that are used? In this scenario, if I have 3 slots that fill up, it will be hard to store any more. If I use resources and distribute them evenly, each item should have a probability of being stored based on the resources I give it. This means predictions are identical in many cases, but standard deviations are not. I'm not sure what that means yet. Memory span. Miller found that the maximum number of units recalled without error is 7 plus or minus 2. And memory span is not limited to a certain number of items, but by the number of chunks. Chunking is when you group a series of apparently random items into a smaller number of meaningful segments to enhance recall. When rehearsing and long-term memory are factored out, Cowan found that short-term capacity is approximately 4 chunks. So for instance, when you rehearse a phone number, you rehearse it in chunks. So you might go, 0455 000 111. That's 3 chunks anyway. Serial position curve. A serial position curve shows a tendency to recall the first and last items in a series best and the middle items as a series worst. So I think that sort of suggests that, for instance, my brother's name is Colin Joseph Harry Ward, and if I told someone that, they would be more likely to remember his first and last name before he'll remember the middle section. I'm not 100%. I have to go into that a little bit further. Here's where it wants us to watch a video called Encoding Strategies for more information on encoding and its effect on memory systems. So that YouTube video is Encoding Strategies, Processing the Environment, and it's by Khan Academy, Khan. The first reading for this week is the Multi-Store Model. Atkinson and Shiffen described the basic architecture of the memory system. And remember, the architecture is the organisation of the memory system. So the basic architecture of the memory system is sensory stores, each modality specific, for example, limited to one sensory modality, and holding information very briefly. The short-term memory store of very limited capacity, and the long-term store of essentially unlimited capacity, holding information over very long periods of time. With the sensory stores, some are attended to and sent to the short-term memory, and then some things in the short-term memory will be sent to the long-term memory. According to the multi-store model, environmental stimulation is initially processed by the sensory stores. These stores are modality specific, example vision and hearing. Information is held very briefly in the sensory stores, with some being attended to and processed further by the short-term store. I've just said that twice now. Some information processed in the short-term store is transferred to the long-term store. There is a direct relationship between the amount of rehearsal in the short-term store and the strength of the stored memory trace in the long-term memory. Sensory stores. Will cover iconic memory, which is a sensory store that holds visual information for approximately 500 milliseconds or perhaps somewhat longer. And echoic memory is a sensory store that holds auditory information for approximately 2 seconds. So icon is eyes, echo is ears. The visual store, which is the iconic memory, holds visual information briefly. Sperling argued that information in iconic memory decays within about 500 milliseconds. However, this may be an underestimate. Iconic memory is very useful because the mechanisms responsible for visual perception always operate on the icon. More generally, the existence of iconic memory increases the time for which visual information is available to us, for example, when reading. It has typically been assumed that iconic memory is pre-attentive, meaning it does not depend on attention. This assumption was accepted by Atkinson and Shiffen, suggesting attention occurs only after information has been held in the sensory stores. Recent evidence suggests that this assumption is incorrect. Purser and others found storage of information in iconic memory was severely disrupted if participants engaged in an attentionally demanding task at the same time. Echoic memory. The auditory equivalent of iconic memory holds auditory information for a few seconds. In everyday life, suppose someone asked you a question while your mind was elsewhere. Perhaps you replied, "What did you say?" just before realising you know what had been said. This playback facility depends on the echoic store. Brain activation was measured when tones were presented. The duration of echoic memory was longer in the left hemisphere than the right, a maximum of 5 seconds versus 2 seconds, respectively. This hemispheric difference probably reflects the dominance of the left hemisphere in language processing. There are sensory stores associated with each of the other senses, example touch and taste. However, they are less important than iconic and echoic memory and have attracted much less research. Short-term memory. The key term here is chunks, which is stored units formed from integrating smaller pieces of information, such as remembering phone numbers in chunks, 555, 00, 173, whatever. Or grouping groceries, for example, grouping your fruit and vegetables, and then grouping baking goods, and grouping your meats. For example, I need bananas, oranges and apples. I also need eggs, flour and milk, and I need sausages and chicken. So you're grouping them into sections of the supermarket, I guess. Short-term memory has a very limited capacity. Consider digit span. Participants listen to a random digit series and then repeat the digits back immediately in the correct order. There are also letter and word spans. The maximum number of items recalled without error is typically about 7. That's the plus or minus 2. There are 2 reasons for rejecting 7 items as the capacity of short-term memory. First, we must distinguish between items and chunks, which are groups of items that have been collected together and treated as a single unit. Memory span involves a random series of items, and so the number of chunks corresponds to the number of items. In contrast, suppose you were given the following letters on a letter span task: P, S, Y, C, H, O, L, O, G, Y. There are 10 letters, but only 1 chunk, and so your recall would be perfect, hopefully. Psychology was the word. Second, estimates of short-term memory capacity are often inflated because participants' performance depends on rehearsal and long-term memory. The concept of a chunk is rather vague. Mathy and Feldman argued that people process a string of items by compressing them into the smallest possible number of distinct sequences or chunks. The number of chunks so defined that were recalled immediately in order was 3 or 4. A similar capacity limit has been obtained in several other studies. Chen and Cowan presented participants with chunks consisting of single words or pairs of words learned previously. Rehearsal was prevented by articulatory suppression, saying the repeatedly. Only 3 chunks were recalled in the absence of rehearsal. Within the multi-store model, it is assumed that all items have equal importance. However, this is an oversimplification. Suppose several items are presented, followed very rapidly by another, a probe item. Participants decide whether the probe item corresponds to any of the list items. Response to the probe is faster when it corresponds to the most recently rehearsed item than when it corresponds to any of the other items. Thus, the item within short-term memory that is the current focus of attention has a privileged position. How is information lost from short-term memory? 2 main answers have been proposed. First, information may decay over time in the absence of rehearsal. Second, there may be interference. This interference could come from items on previous trials and/or from information presented during the retention interval. Berman and others claimed that interference is more important than decay. Short-term memory performance on any given trial was disrupted by words presented on the previous trial. Suppose this disruption effect occurred because the words from the previous trial had not decayed sufficiently. If so, disruption would have been greatly reduced by increasing the time interval between trials. In fact, increasing the inter-trial interval had no effect on performance. However, the disruption effect was largely eliminated when interference from previous trials was reduced. Campoy pointed out that Berman's research was limited. Their experimental design did not allow them to observe any decay occurring within 3.3 seconds of an item being presented. Campoy discovered there were strong decay effects at time intervals shorter than 3.3 seconds. Thus, decay occurs mostly at short retention intervals and interference at longer ones. Is short-term memory distinct from long-term memory? If they are separate, there should be some patients with impaired long-term memory but intact short-term memory and others showing the opposite pattern. This would produce a double disassociation. The findings are generally supportive. Patients with amnesia have severe long-term memory impairments but typically have intact short-term memory. A few brain-damaged patients have severely impaired short-term memory but intact long-term memory. For example, KF had no problems with long-term learning and recall, but had a very small digit span. Subsequent research indicated that his short-term memory problems focused mainly on recall of letters, words, or digits rather than meaningful sounds or visual stimuli. Evaluation. The multi-store approach has various strengths and has had enormous influence. It is still widely accepted that there are important conceptual distinctions between three kinds of memory stores. Several kinds of experimental evidence provided strong support for the crucial distinction between short-term and long-term memory. However, evidence probably comes from brain-damaged patients having impairments only to short-term or long-term memory. So what are the model's limitations? First, it is very oversimplified. It is assumed the short-term and long-term stores are both unitary, that is, each store always operates in a single uniform way. Second, it is assumed the short-term store acts as a gateway between the sensory stores and long-term memory. This is incorrect because the information processed in short-term memory has already made contact with information in long-term memory. Consider our ability to rehearse IBM as a single chunk in short-term memory. We can do this only because we have previously accessed relevant information in long-term memory. Third, Atkinson and Schifrin assumed that information in short-term memory represents the contents of consciousness. This implies that only information processed consciously can be stored in long-term memory. However, implicit learning, which is learning without conscious awareness of what has been learned, appears to exist and leads to long-term memory. Fourth, the assumption that all items within short-term memory have equal status is correct. In fact, the item currently receiving attention can be accessed more rapidly than the other items in short-term memory. Fifth, it was assumed that most information is transferred to long-term memory via rehearsal. This greatly exaggerates the role of rehearsal. Only a small fraction of the information we have stored in long-term memory was rehearsed during learning. Next, we move on to the Unitary Store Model. The Unitary Store Model was first proposed by Nelson Cowan in 1998. Unlike the multi-model concept of memory storage and division, the Unitary Store Model proposes that there is one single store of memory. Model and evidence. Although this model is different from Baddeley's working model, it is not incompatible with it. It postulates different types of access to the memory system and different levels of activation. This model shows that there are stimuli that come in and that information is processed and stored in the long-term memory via sensory buffers. In this model, our short-term memory is actually the activated or working proportions of our long-term, which is the information we pay attention to. The result of this is that we end up with a single unitary memory system that is accessed in different ways. On the whole, the model is sound. However, there are a number of different ideas that are captured in working memory which aren't necessarily captured within this unitary model. So in the model, it shows stimuli is received by our sensory buffers, and then it's got the short-term memory is inside the long-term memory, which is inactive, and that the short-term memory is the active part of the long-term memory. Interesting. It suggests that some items in the long-term memory can be activated by focusing our attention on them when a task requires it. An example would be when we have to recall a phone number. We focus on that memory, and by focusing our attention on it, it activates and we are able to remember it in our short-term memory. The Unitary Store Model assumes that short-term memory consists of temporary activations of long-term memory representations, for example, images and words, or recently perceived items. Activations usually arise from focused attention and highly vulnerable to distraction. It also assumes that amnesiacs' long-term memory impairments due to impaired relational memory. We need to find relationships between item and context. If you can't find them, recall will be difficult. Short-term memory does not require relational information to be processed, thus amnesiacs are fine at it. Primarily supported by the hippocampus and surrounding medial temporal lobe, in brackets associative memory structures. and the correlations activation has with behaviour. Evidence for unitary store models. Hanula and others researched amnesiac participants who were given scenes to study. In the study, some scenes were later repeated exactly, whereas others had objects that had moved in the scene. When compared to controls, amnesiac's recognition was impaired even at short lags, short-term memory in brackets. This was likely due to relational memory impairments. Recognition also fell to chance at longer lags, long-term memory. As a result, amnesiacs had shown short-term memory impairments under relational memory conditions, thus demonstrating that there is no pure dissociation between short-term memory and long-term memory. In another study, Hanula and Ranganath asked participants to study 4 objects at different locations and then mentally rotated the display. Participants had to determine whether a second display matched the rotated version. In the task, activation in the left hippocampus predicted relational performance at a short-term interval, as hippocampus damage is related to short-term memory problems and when relationships are learned. Now back to the readings, which was Eysenck and Keane, still don't know how to say that, pages 213 to 214. Unitary Store Model. Joanides and others argue that the multi-store model should be replaced by a unitary store model. According to the unitary store model, short-term memory consists of temporary activations of long-term memory representations or of representations of items that were recently perceived. Such representations are especially likely to occur when they are the focus of attention. Atkinson and Schifrin emphasised the differences between short-term and long-term memory, whereas advocates of the unitary store approach focus on the similarities. There are certainly close links between short-term and long-term memory. For example, word span is approximately 7 words if the words are random. However, it can be 20 words if the words form sentences. This enhanced word span involves forming large chunks, integrated units, which depends heavily on long-term memory. How can unitary store models explain amnesic patients having essentially intact short-term memory but severely impaired long-term memory? Joanides argued that they have special problems in forming novel relations, example between items and their context, in both short-term and long-term memory. Amnesic patients perform well on short-term memory tasks because such tasks typically do not require storing relational information. Thus, amnesic patients should have impaired short-term memory performance on tasks requiring relational memory. According to Joanides, the hippocampus and surrounding medial temporal lobes, damaged in amnesic patients, are crucial for forming novel relations. Multi-store theorists assume these structures are much more involved in long-term memory than short-term memory. However, unitary store models predict the hippocampus and medial temporal lobes would be involved if a short-term memory task required forming novel relations. So I'm guessing relational memory is that relationship between items and their context, because I don't recall reading relational memory anywhere. The findings. Much relevant research involves amnesic patients with damage to the medial temporal lobes, including the hippocampus, although other brain areas can be damaged. As predicted by the unitary store approach, such patients often perform poorly on memory tasks with a fairly brief interval between study and test. In one study, scenes were presented and then repeated exactly or with one object having been removed spatially. Amnesic patients with hippocampal damage and healthy controls decided whether each scene had been viewed previously. Amnesic patients performed worse than controls, even with a very short retention interval, suggesting the hippocampus is needed even for relational short-term memory. However, long-term memory may have been involved in the Hanula study. A similar task was used, but with reduced memory load to minimise the involvement of long-term memory. Amnesic patients, all with hippocampal damage, had comparable memory performance to controls. Thus, the hippocampus is not essential for good relational short-term memory. Several neuroimaging studies have reported hippocampal involvement in short-term memory. However, it has generally been unclear whether hippocampal activation was due in part to encoding for long-term memory. An exception was a study by Bergman and others who assessed short-term and long-term memory for word pairs. The key evidence related to brain activation when short-term memory for word pairs was successful, but subsequent long-term memory was not. Learning of these word pairs was not associated with hippocampal activation. I'm just confused now. Clarification of the brain areas involved in short-term memory was obtained by Race and others. They assessed face recognition memory with an 8-second retention interval in amnesic patients and healthy controls. Patients with brain damage limit to the hippocampus had intact memory performance, whereas those with more extensive damage to the medial temporal lobes had impaired memory performance. Evaluation. As predicted by Unitary Store Models, activation of part of long-term memory typically plays an important role in short-term memory. There is also some controversial support for the notion that forming novel relations in short-term memory may involve the hippocampus. More promisingly, related areas of the medial temporal lobes may be involved in short-term as well as long-term memory. What are the limitations of the unitary store approach? First, it is oversimplified to argue that short-term memory is only activated long-term memory. We can manipulate activated long-term memory in flexible ways going well beyond simply activating part of long-term memory. Two examples are backward digit recall, recalling digits in the opposite order to the one presented, and generating novel visual images. Second, most studies on amnesic patients suggest hippocampal involvement is far greater in long-term memory than short-term memory. Such findings are more consistent with the multi-store approach than the unitary store approach. Third, the findings of neuroimaging studies are not supportive of the unitary store approach. There is little evidence of hippocampal involvement when attempts are made to separate out short-term and long-term memory processes. So the only thing I can see confirmed here is that part of the long-term memory is activated when using the short-term memory. There isn't much evidence that there's hippocampus involvement, and it looks like medial temporal lobes may be involved in short-term and long-term memory.